Listen, we want to welcome you to PMS, our last panel discussion, and we're going to have a great time tonight. Listen, what I need you to do is make sure that you share this with as many people as you can. We also want you to make comments to the post, whether on Facebook or YouTube. We want to hear from you. We have a great panel tonight, and we want to hear from you, answer your questions, and really dig into this discussion tonight of social justice. And so before we get started and involved in this, I want to introduce our panel for this evening. And to my right, we have Major Willie Hickman, who was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. He's been now in law enforcement for over 20 years and now serves as major at the Berkeley County Sheriff's Department. And he also provides security training for churches across the state. We also have Deputy Sheriff Meron Kelly, born and raised in Columbia, South Carolina, in the northern part of Columbia. And upon graduating from Columbia High School, he attended the great South Carolina State University, the Bulldogs, garnered in blue, with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. He also pursued his master's degree from the University of Louisville, majoring in justice administration. He has and serves on various committees and community organizations in the state, and it's too many to list that is on his bio, but we're glad to have him. We also have here Representative Ivory Thigpen, born and raised in Jackson, Mississippi. He now serves as the pastor of Rehoboth Baptist Church. He serves on executive boards with the Baptist E&M Convention of South Carolina on the executive board. He also is a graduate of Jackson State University, where he obtained a degree in biology, pre-medical, and inducted in Beta Kappa Chi Scientific Honor Society. That means he's really, really smart. He's also he also attended Palmer College. And he's also a doctor and a chiropractor with his wife at the Restore Chiropractic Family Wellness Center here in Columbia. And then we have Commissioner and Pastor Aaron Bishop. He is actually a graduate of Savannah State and has a bachelor's degree of history and a master's of biblical studies from Grace Divinity College and Biblical Studies. He's also the pastor of Grace Christian Church. He also sits on the board of Richland School District 1 here in Columbia, South Carolina. He's also a proud member of Omega Psi Phi, which I believe Meron is as well. So we have 2 Omegas and 1 Kappa. Amen. Let's pray. Aaron also serves and has multiple awards as well that we don't have time to mention, but I'm glad to have everybody here tonight. Once again, we want to welcome you to this. We're going to be talking about a hot topic. And tonight, I just want to warn you, we don't want to keep you long, but this may go a little longer than the 45 minutes that we have designated for that. But we're going to try to stick to close to that as much as we can. So let's dive into this. So my first question, after the pandemic, we saw the death of George Floyd, and we saw protests across not just the nation, but across the world about what we saw happen, seeing the police officer have his knee on his neck. Many people began to cry out about police brutality and the abuse of their power. And as a police officer, I'll give this to you, Meron. What can the police do or law enforcement do to gain the trust of the community?
Thank you for the question, Pastor. And I think the George Floyd moment, and I will call it a moment, was an awakening period, not only for the nation, but for the world. It impacted everyone, no matter where you sat. I think it raised the consciousness of law enforcement to show that we needed to do a better job, and even calling out other peers. There is no one that could have seen what happened and say that that was right. So I think we had to do a better job as law enforcement calling out what was wrong. But it invites also the conversation of how we can do our jobs better. Sometimes we don't know what's best for a community, and I know that what happened, as unfortunate as it was, invited us to have those hard conversations with communities, whereas we typically wouldn't. And those are ongoing conversations, from defunding the police to revision of policies to chokeholds and when to arrest. I think it invited the dialogue and conversation that was so very needed in our communities.
Captain Hickman, you know, we also see, even with what Meron said about the police and the response of that, what are some measures? Because we constantly hear what the police is doing wrong. And I know that there's a response that we don't give room oftentimes to police officers or to law enforcement to kind of defend themselves or to speak to the issues at hand. What can we do, as I'm raising a black son, 2 black sons, what can we do to teach them how to interact with police so we don't see on the news another black boy dying to the hands of police?
Again, thank you, Pastor, for inviting us here. And I agree with Melron. George Floyd incident was wrong on all levels. What we need to teach our children is, number one, is that we don't need to have a court session on the side of the road. And what that really means is this. We have a lot of our young men now, when they are stopped by the police, they decide to have an encounter with the police on the side of the road. That's not the place to do that. You have your day in court, and the thinking is now you want to get home safe. Teach them to have their license ready, driver's license, and all that stuff ready. And if they don't feel safe, when they stop, they can pull into a public place. They just turn their blinkers on, the emergency flashes, and pull in somewhere where they feel safe. But I see a lot of our young men just wanting to have that encounter on the side of the road, and it's just not good. Just like I said, most police officers, if not all, in South Carolina are wearing body cams. So if you felt like you've been treated unjust or unfair or whatever, you know, have that day to be able to go home and make it home, and you know, take it from that point on is what I would suggest.
Yeah, and we had this conversation one day, and I was telling you how, you know, one day I was driving, me and my wife were driving home. I was at a stoplight. I made the right when the light turned green. I made sure I did everything right because I saw the police behind me. So I turned my signal light on, made the right. He turned his lights on, pulled me over. Of course, he came to the car, said license and registration. And I said, no problem. I reached in, got my license, registration, insurance, provided him with that. And I said, hello, officer, could you tell me why I was pulled over? I said license and registration. Mm-hmm. Now, I was calm, but he wasn't calm. Mm-hmm. So at this point, I'm like, I just asked you a question. You didn't have to talk to me that way. Right. So then it was, can you just give me the license and registration? Now, once again, I was calm, but he started that. Right. You know what I'm saying? And so, and I'm not saying this is in a situation in every case, but can a person ask the police officer why they were stopped?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think that what we need to do a better job of realizing is people aren't scared to go to jail, but what they won't tolerate, especially black men, we don't want to be disrespected. And when you try to take someone's dignity and respect, people will die over it. And just quite frankly, they're not going to allow certain things in 2020 or there before to tolerate certain things. So I think you have to use that as a measuring rod of, if I want to receive respect, I have to give it. Just the golden rule, simple stuff. Sir, you didn't signal. Or, ma'am, you know, your seatbelt isn't fast. Just that measure of dignity and respect that you give people and afford them, you're going to get it in return, because guess what? People aren't scared to go to jail. They know they're going to get out. But when you reach for that man's dignity and respect and try to take that away, especially in front of his family, you're asking for an altercation. And we shouldn't police for altercations. We should police for positive outcomes of situations. So instead of license and registration, it's, sir, you didn't turn on your signal, and how can we help get through this stop together, I think is the outcome that we're always looking for.
Thanks. Aaron, Bishop, so you sit on the board with the school district. You do a lot of things in the community, and you know, we're seeing, this seems like the disrespect to police. So it seems as if both sides are being disrespected at some point. What do you think we need to do as relates to our community's response to law enforcement?
Well, first of all, Pastor Sam, I want to tell you thank you. There's a quote that says, It's important to be nice, but it's nice. It was nice to be important, but it's important to be nice. Thank you for being nice enough to have this conversation tonight. One of the things I believe Richland One has done, we have recognized that we have what you call ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences Syndrome, or what we call trauma-infused environments, with kids who are trying to sleep through the night and hear gunshots. Kids who grow up knowing that something happened traumatic with a engagement with their parents, their uncles, their aunties, with law enforcement, grow up with attitude to believe that they don't trust law enforcement. But that's why I can appreciate the leadership of Mayor Ron Kelly, who is from this community and stays in the community. And so what I believe we can do is constantly grow our own, or do a pathway towards policing in the community. What Richland One has done is not only combat the trauma-infused child who has seen death, who has seen gunshots, who grew up not trusting the police. They have also done something to make sure essential workers are valued. For example, when you think of essential workers, you think of police officers, and you also think of fire department. Well, Richland One has a program where we're growing firefighters, because there was a lack of firefighters in our community. I believe the same thing could be done when we begin to make a partnership with the City of Columbus Police Department and Richland County Department to make children aware of the pathway towards law enforcement, thus tracing and trusting the relationship of law enforcement.
Can I jump in on it, Simmons?
I think that's so good. I'm sorry, you want to respond to that?
Can I jump in on it?
Sure.
And to go with what he's saying, you're exactly right. I had a situation about a month ago at a skating ring when I was working off duty, and I was outside talking on the phone, and the security must have put a kid out. And this kid came out, and he was just enraged, and he's like, this, that, and another. And he said, as a matter of fact, I'm going to get a brick, and I'm going to bust your window, and I'm going to cut your tires. And I'm just looking at him, right? You know, and then I finally said, young man, come here. And he took a while, but he came. And first of all, I asked him how old was he. And he said he's 14. And I was like, okay, my son is 14. I would knock his teeth out if he was to talk to anybody like that. But, you know, I said, what did I do to you? He said, well, them people put me out. I said, I understand that. I had nothing to do with that. And I said, first of all, if you bust the windows and you cut my tires, I said, that ain't my car. I told him like that. I said, that ain't my car. I said, but what will the end result be for you? And after we had that conversation, I saw that he came around a little while to be able to have that conversation. And I don't think nobody else probably would have took the time to have that conversation with him. So I do agree with what you said.
I mean, having an interaction with our community is important. And before we get to our next question, once again, please, those of you who are sharing, who are viewing, I want you to share this. This is information that I think is very important for you to know, very important. I would even encourage you to even have your children to sit down around the TV or the computer right now to actually hear what we're talking about, because it's important. Like, for example, I remember, or even if you have any questions, but I remember, recently, my oldest son got his license, and so me and my wife were just having conversation about, you know, because the front part of the front windows are tinted, and so we were having discussions of whether or not we should take the tint off the windows, or should we leave them on, and then, you know, I had to have the conversation. You know, the conversation of, hey, if you ever get stopped, this is what you do. This is how you respond. I moved the registration and the insurance card into where the mirror is, so that he doesn't even have to reach for the glove compartment, because I don't want there to be any, I thought you were reaching for something. But as we deal with this, we have so many issues that as black men that we're trying to teach our children so that they can come home. Even as a pastor and as a representative in passing legislation, Pastor Dick, how would you respond to a situation like that? What do you think you could provide a family or the community on how we can better educate the next generation?
Right. I think great question, great topic. I want to echo the points of really all the panelists that, you know, I think this is a great thing that's being done. I want to encourage you to continue to do it. It's definitely needed. It's a privilege to be here. With that being said, the challenge I think we have, it is a respect thing, but I think it's really about authority as well. We give law enforcement a certain authority, really, to use lethal power and force if necessary. But there also, with that authority, comes some responsibility. Right. I tell my boys, I got 2 boys and 2 girls. I told my boys, the number one responsibility is to get home. Don't slap the lion while you got your head in his mouth. Because it's going to hurt you a whole lot more than it's going to hurt the lion. And so we cannot negate or forget that law enforcement has been given the authority to use lethal force, and it's at their discretion. I've been around enough law enforcement to know that it is a escalation, and there are certain parameters in which they have to have met before they can escalate to one level to another. But beyond that, because the average citizen and person does not know that, maybe something we can educate communities. That's one thing we could do about how they engage. But beyond that, I think you have to be smart enough to know, as you stated, Major, when to walk away and when is the time to confront. With that being said, I think there has to be accountability. So that's the accountability piece for the community. The accountability piece for the law enforcement is that we also have to know that law enforcement is not above the law. When it comes to misconduct, when it comes to approaches and how law enforcement treats and handles, I think we have not done a good enough job of being consistent across the board in having law enforcement be accountable to community, transparent to community, and therefore I think that's why we lack the trust sometimes that we need, particularly as African-American men. And I've heard Deputy Chief Melron say this many times, when you put on the badge, there's a history that comes with it. And psychologically, the people can't detach from it, whether it's their own experience, the ACEs that you described, or whether it is the documented history of law enforcement and why it came about and what was its initial purposes. That I don't think that's lost. And so I think it's a lot of moving parts, but I think it begins with what you said, and I was so excited to hear it because I would go a step further. Not only do we need to have programs, which I understand that's the type of program that the deputy chief came up in, and I think he's excellent. But we have to train up our young people to become protectors in their communities, givers to their community and not takers. A lot of these young men are around violence and they're not afraid to die. I mean, sometimes just being real African-American men, it's just reality of coming up. I tell my kids, I went to public schools, I went to private schools too, but, I was like, we literally walked the halls with killers, and we knew they were killers. We knew they were killers. But you had to, for lack of a better word, man up, and you knew how you had to move. I say that to say, particularly when we have at-risk young men, I think these are the men that we really can steer towards being protectors instead of perpetrators in their communities. And I think that's a key piece.
I was just going to say, we have to always invite opportunities amongst each other to engage with these young people in non-enforcement opportunities. Each one of you have congregations. Invite law enforcement into your congregations at the appropriate time to engage with young men on how we get through a traffic stop together. What happens when someone calls 911 and gives your description? What is the officer going to do? That way they can ask the questions, they can go through the practical exercises, and it's not on the side of a road during a stop. And I think the more we do that, those encounters in a non-enforcement area, I think helps. The other side of that is everyone likes to talk about public safety. Public safety. Public safety does not mean policing. Public safety is me as a community member, as a young man in my area, making sure that everyone is okay, making sure that cars aren't getting broken into, making sure that I'm taking care of my neighbors and being my brother's keeper. And I think we need to, and I don't want to use the term de-police, but we need to remove police from the equation of public safety in so much as keeping neighborhoods safe. We are a tool of that, but it's the community that makes sure it happens.
Melron, would you recall a time when there was an incident, I don't want to hijack the conversation, that a young man was shot by a highway patrolman on Broad River Road? And do you remember the response we had when we ask you as well as Chief Holbrook, who had just got to Columbia, and Sheriff Leon Lott, and even the Highway Patrol to come to Eau Claire.
Yeah.
And we literally began to heal the community because we had a courageous conversation. And I think that as pastors and leaders, whenever something happens in West Philly, a threat to violence, a threat to peace anywhere is a threat to peace everywhere. We need to be very proactive and not only have these type of conversations, but when we come out of the pandemic and get back to what could be a normal, that we respond with this level of trust that here's what we do in our city.
And those interactions made for a better Columbia Police Department. And Chief Holbrook will tell you the same thing. But they're hard conversations. They're not easy to confront. Histories, because African Americans, in my opinion, view law enforcement through a lens of history. Not so much how we were treated, but by how stories that our uncles and fathers and cousins told us how they were treated on traffic stops. So we view that, and that's for some people that's trauma. I'm not going to stop for the police because my cousin got beat up when he stopped. So we have to talk about those things and how to counteract those through facts and training in some instances.
Well, I want to chime in because I think it's an important point. I have law enforcement in my family. One of the things that I've quoted in our recent hearings is that, I got a first cousin that was raised like a brother that's chief of police in Yazoo City in Mississippi. But my point is his son, myself, we've all have had adverse experiences with law enforcement. I can think of 3 just off the top of my head that were horrible. I wondered whether I was going to walk away with my life with one of them. There was really 4 if I count all of them. One here, even as a pastor, and I'll tell that one quickly. I was in my office late one night working, as many times I do work on a sermon. This is before I was an elected official, and my truck was parked under the little breezeway, and officer pulled up. It was deputy sheriff, and he drew his gun and said, "Come out now." And I said, "No, you got to put your gun away first." And he's like, "I said come out," and I understood that's a lawful command. But to your point, I need you to calm down. I need you to holster your gun. I say, my name's on the marquee. You can run my license. I put my driver's license on the window. But I promise you, and I wasn't even standing in front of the window. I was, peeking over. I'm not coming out till you holster your gun. And then even I can think back to even when I was a college student, man. I was on a date with a young lady, first time too. Got completely emasculated by the police. I'm talking about took every bit of my manhood, in front of her, And I say all of that to say we can't allow that to be the broad brush that we paint all interactions with, because everybody isn't like that. And I have intentionally tried to build relationships and connections and better my understanding of what it means and the role of a police officer, which I have a much better understanding. As a chaplain, I understand most officers just want to get home safely to their families. I've gone through the use of force training with Richland County. Man, it's life or death. I went through use of force training not even 6 months ago, and I got shot 5 times just because the situation changed just that fast. And so I understand the difficulties in doing the job. That's why I think when you talk about what we have to do, I think it has to be consistency across the board. I think that's what's missing more than anything else. That's not to say there aren't good cops. That's not to say there aren't bad interactions. But I think we should be able to count on and know exactly how things are going to be resolved, the way they're going to be resolved. And then if it strays away from that we know what the consequences are going to be.
Something you said, and I was sharing this with Major Hickman earlier, was that sometimes what we have to do, we have a tendency to put everybody in the same pot. That all men are dogs, right? Or all politicians are crooked, or all preachers are pimps, or all police officers are abusing their power, and that's not the case. And so I'm from the country, and I used to see, them plant trees and grow trees. And I remember one apple tree in particular, it would always, bear fruit during this particular season. And ever so often, there would be a rotten apple. But for the majority of that tree, what it produced was good apples, right? So the tree isn't bad. It was just that one apple. Now, if all the apples are bad, that's another discussion. But we have a tendency to blame the entire tree the entire system, every person involved, as if everybody is wrong because of one situation. Even speaking of today, seeing the young man die in, I believe it's Philadelphia, shot 10 times today. And once again, we're going to see the response of people who are angry because once again, he was shot by 2 white cops. And so it's going to be a response. And once again, it's going to be, once again, we see another black man shot by a white man, and then the racial conversation, then the police conversation. And I think what we have to do is we have to give law enforcement a voice, because you're human, you're tired. We don't know what you just saw. We don't know if you just came from a home with someone who just committed suicide, or you don't know if maybe you had to go to the house to see or to see someone take children out of a home because of a DSS situation, or we don't know the emotional state of the police officer, because you're human. And now you come off and you say something like license or registration, or hey son, or hey boy, calm down, or don't call me boy. And it's like, this is not the day for this, because all of us have limitations. And I think what we have to do is we really have to sit down, have a conversation, and realize that the person who is engaging had a day, the officer had a day, and we're hoping and praying that the both of them can get home. Not one of them get home. And so there's a question that we have on Facebook. It says, Dickman, I give this to you. Would the state of South Carolina entertain a law that has universal policing for all state departments, and would give guidelines on banning forceful moves like chokeholds, and acknowledge the words like "I can't breathe" to and disengage?
I think that's a great question. Currently, I sit on the committee that was formed really due to the unrest and the protests that happened after everybody know the incident in Minnesota. And so, yes, I think there's a bipartisan effort. I know at least on the House side, I believe also on the Senate side, to it's the committee is called Equitable Criminal Justice and Law Enforcement Reform. We've taken a lot of testimony from persons as well as officers as to what needs to be happened. Because I think standards is one thing. I think having clear standards from across the state, and one of the things, and I don't want to be too long, we talk about accreditation and the level and what agencies are accredited in the state, and really moving that to a much higher percentage. There's some cost and some labor involved with that, but I think that's one of the things that moves us closer to that. But I think also too, whether it be through law or whether it be through policy that's provided by the training academy, is that there have to be across the board, this is what we're going to do. And presently, that's not the case. It's kind of a voluntary basis with a lot of things that I believe we're going to have to move to being mandatory. So I do think there is an initial effort that is taking place, and I do think it needs to happen. I do think some steps have already been taken, but I do think it needs to be codified, meaning that even if it is in a policy, I do think it needs to come in the form of a law so that it will be the law of the land. But one of the things I want to say, as we talked about,
Sure.
the incident that happened today and the incidents that continue to happen in our community, as we took testimony from all the different agencies and all the different groups, one of the things that we saw was we were there for approximately about 4 hours. It was about the last 15 minutes that we got to talk about race. And even though psychological evaluations are good, really we do have to have a filter and a test for racial bias. I know you all have heard of FBI studies that said that, literally there were some supremacist and racist groups that were seeking to infiltrate law enforcement and to use that as the means in which they would conduct really war and violent crimes against other races. And there's no doubt that I believe there's a perception that black men are seen as a threat. Now, some may quote statistics of violence, but really crime tends to be more geographically linked than anything else. They're more opportunity linked than anything else. So the reality of it is we are no more violent and no more criminal than any other people, but yet there's a narrative that paints African Americans as dangerous, and sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's subconscious. Sometimes people may switch over, grab their pocketbook, or lock their door when they see an African American male. And I think those are the things we have to begin to have conversation about. I think, one, we have to recapture the narrative of what it means to be black men and what black represents. But I also think there has to be a conversation internally in the agencies about weeding out those type of people and having those type of filters, because I don't know if that's a conversation, a courageous conversation that's really willing to be had at this point in time. And that's my principal concern, because as a black man, when we on the state floor debated whether or not we have open carry, they call it constitutional carry to make it sound better, but open carry for everyone. And I said, I have to address this in the African American context. When you look at the death of Trayvon Martin, and the list goes on, Michael Brown, their blackness was seen as a threat. Their blackness was seen as a weapon. And, the boy had tea and Skittles. And so if your blackness is seen as a threat, whether you have a hoodie on or not, you mean to tell me you're talking about letting them have now a weapon that you can openly see when what I can assess is when it goes to trial, what's being adjudicated is whether or not the officer or the person, it's not even officer sometimes, whether or not the person feared for their life. And many times it's just the only thing that caused them to fear for their life was that they were black.
Yeah. Well, we have to watch sometimes comments like that come from a place of privilege. I don't think I would have recommended that, for knowing growing up in an African American community what that would suggest. First thing. Second part is violence a lot of times is about proximity more so than who commits it. So far this year, unfortunately, we've had 18 homicides in the city of Columbia. 16 of them were African American males. Of that 16, to date, we believe only one of them was unknown perpetrator. So that tells me that of the 16 African American males that were killed this year, all of them were killed by people that they knew or had some type of contact or relationship with. So again, to your point, it's about proximity, not this black on black thing that we're trying to suggest. Same thing with other racial groups. We harm people that are closest to us. And it is unfortunate, and we just have to work on a better way of breaking that cycle.
So I've also learned that the president has also stopped diversity training on the federal level. So if we're going to have this conversation about race and culture, and as a black man, understanding that what would you do if you saw another black man carry a gun or what have you, how does the nation move forward when now the education of that is no longer being funded? Bishop, want to respond to that?
Yeah, so I think each house lays on its own foundation. And as a school district, sometimes, for lack of words, you got to rob Peter to pay Paul. You got to steal from, I'm sorry about the words. You got to take from one pot to take care of another one. And it's no secret we're in the pandemic, right? And one of the things that I told somebody when we were looking at the George Floyd incident, maybe even now West Philly, I thank God that we may still be in a pandemic for a little bit longer, because we had to infuse social emotional health within our curriculum. Because picture this, during a time with the climate of our election, it's stirring up youth and adults with MAGA hats on one side and Black Lives Matter on another one. What do you think the school district will look like if something begins to incite? When you look at what we're talking about, the social emotional health, we had to make sure that we've had the courageous conversation with students about race, about diversity, about an understanding of a bias or implicit bias. We did a lot to make sure that when our children return back to school, that we don't have a riot on our hand. And now even tonight in the school board meeting, we have to give our contract to our SROs, which means the SROs is a priority to opening up schools. These are the indicators. These are the signs. These are the things that we have to put in place as a school district to ensure that safety and security is a priority, along with feeding children and educating children. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot to do to make sure that education is not disrupted. And I think not only in the schoolhouse, but I think it needs to be done in the church house. I think that we need to bridge the gap between the church house and the schoolhouse to make sure that we understand we all are a village. If it takes a village to raise a child, imagine what it does to raise a community. What does it take to make sure that we build our community so strong that when the storms of racism or violence comes, that we're not torn down? Because when you have riots in your community, it's a statistic that says that it takes about 20 years for that community to recover. So when we burn down our communities because we're upset and we're frustrated from a level of violence that is a outcry from poverty or lack of resources and opportunity, then we're setting ourselves back even further. We're resetting our communities when we face these situations. So the school district is trying to make sure we're being proactive, because it may be a matter of time. If things don't change in our nation, then we could be looking at another setback. And by the way, just so we lighten the mood up a little bit, the Kappas talk more than the Qs.
I'm trying to make up because I'm outnumbered. Bless the Lord. But I think that is a great question. I think a lot of people aren't even aware of the executive order that was passed recently. It was passed in the last few weeks, where basically, well, the good thing about it is it's an executive order, which means that, it can be changed by the next president. But it was basically tied to funding, that if you offered basically any training that spoke negatively of America, or basically made an accusation that America was racist or needed sensitivity or diversity training or inclusion training, then basically you could be disqualified for federal grants and federal money, which is a game changer. Because really, to your point, education really is a key in changing the mindsets of the generations to come. So this was a major blow. And I do think that a lot of ground was being made. As a matter of fact, it was one of the things that I ran on in my platform of hope. The H stood for healing racial tensions. And one of the ways that we wanted to heal racial tensions was promoting government training about cultural diversity. And even the word that the deputy chief used, privilege, because a lot of people operate in privilege and don't even understand that they do. They have a bias. For everybody has a bias. As you all are preachers on this side, right? Seminary, we were trained that, you bring to the text your own bias. And you have to identify those. Not only do you have to know the context, but you have to identify your biases. I have found that works across the board in life. As you approach something, you have to identify what your biases are. You have to identify what other biases are. The president has basically passed an executive order that says, no, you can't call out my biases, and I get to ignore my biases. And if you try to call them out, then you disqualify from funding. We're not, and I think this is, and I'll close with this. I think the conversation that we have to begin to have and how we have to frame it is that we want to make America better. All right. And because we do care is why we hold America accountable. But we have really a presidency and a culture that is rising that doesn't want to be held accountable, but wants to be immune from accountability.
We talked a little bit yesterday, and I want to say this. Growing up, politics wasn't a conversation in our home like that. It wasn't. We talked about the things that we saw that was wrong or what have you, but getting into the political landscape was something that we just didn't do. And politics is involved in everything from what happens in our community to community development to opportunity zones to funding. Do we fund the police? Do we not fund where we put grocery stores, education? Do we cut funding for education? It's money and economics involved, it's politics involved. And one of the things I wanted to do in this platform And I wish, to be honest with you, this is the one time I wish thousands of people was watching this, not to get attention, but people could be informed, because, you know, where we suffer, where we have no knowledge is where we suffer. And what we have a tendency to do, and I'm just going to speak freely on this just for a few moments, as a black man born and raised in South Carolina, what I see us do is we always react, and we're like matches. We light up and it goes away. And we never see the change because we're just mad at what happened. Okay, we marched, but we never asked for anything. We had all of these protests, you know, from the first week for the protests to start off all right, for it to end horribly. And we had protest after protest after march after march after march, protest after protest after protest. And I'm not trying to offend anybody in this, but we did not ask for anything. We just marched. And we have to put those who we vote into office under the pressure because they represent us. But because we do not use our voice in voting, because we do not ask, we're not taken seriously. So it's like they're angry. They'll be over there in a week. So now what happens? There's no more protests. There are no more marches, and nothing has changed.
100% agree. But it's also a two-way street. I can't speak for all law enforcement, but for Melron, I have to weigh what's superficial versus what's substantial. And I'll give you an example. During the marches and the protests, there was a lot of talk about, are the officers going to kneel with the protesters? And are the officers going to hold up Black Lives Matter signs? And I had to question myself, and I'm being real personal with you, what's superficial versus what's substantial? See, what's superficial is me not really meaning it, but I'm going to kneel down because that's a good photo op, or me holding a Black Lives Matter sign because that's what the people want. But what's substantial is me going in and reevaluating my policy to say we don't use chokeholds. Superficial versus substantial. What's substantial is me going to the protest line saying, hey, let's meet after this and let's look at police policy. What are those things that you want to see different in your community? Superficial versus substantial. Those things are substantial. And if I really, really care about my community and my son and your son and your son and your son and your son, what's superficial versus substantial? And we got to be serious about this thing, y'all, because this is our community. This is our state, too. And, you know, at the time, I had a big mama that cared about how I was treating people, you know? Mm-hmm. And I had to really know that I represented a community that I grew up in, you know, 555 Farrow Road area, like he represents Belvedere. But we belong to a community, so as an African-American officer that came from this community, I had to weigh what was superficial versus what was substantial. And not to throw stones at anyone who did that, but I had to be real with myself and to my community to know that I wanted to do things that was substantial, that would have lasting impact, that would be in existence way beyond my time at the police department. Superficial versus substantial. We got to stop playing about this thing because people's lives hang in the balance when we don't.
Yeah, and this is why even as Christians, you know, we use this term kingdom a lot. And we're kingdom this and kingdom that and kingdom this and kingdom that. And we use this word so often, and very few churches operate in it. Mm-hmm. And if we're just having church services and you're using the word kingdom, that's all you're doing is having church. Kingdom is having people in positions who have the ability to make choices on the behalf of people because you sit in a seat of influence. So you could be in the House or the State House and say, hey, wait a minute. As a black man, I don't know if we want to have open and carry because maybe that wouldn't have been something that was even said if you weren't there, but because you were, or as we deal with the school district, or as we deal with law enforcement in either county, now that we're in a place of leadership and influence, what do we do to change the narrative of that? And so if we don't understand that, what will happen is we will always have people who are evil. And as the Bible says, the people rejoice
That's right.
when the righteous rule. When you have the right people in the right seat who have a heart for God, not perfect, but have a heart for God, then we can turn things back the way it needs to be. And I'm honored to be on this platform with you all, because all of you are making great contributions in your different areas. And I'm hoping and I'm praying that this panel does something to help a parent, help a young man, or old woman, it doesn't matter, seasoned or not, to understand what can I contribute to change the narrative. How do we use our vote to change not just who is voted as president or mayor or governor, or who sits, in the House or the Senate, but understanding what happens even on the local level. And I think because we don't think our vote matters or our voice matters, we don't exercise that vote. And we had a heavy conversation yesterday, and he was teaching me a lot of different things that I won't share here now because it's not the place for it. But that voting power goes way further or farther than we could really imagine. Well, you want to say something?
I mean, you're just preaching, brother. I love it.
But you said Omegas don't talk as much as Cap. I'm like, go ahead.
But Pastor Sam, you said so much, and I just want to cover maybe one or 2 points. Yes, voting has consequences. Mm-hmm. Voting matters. And for those preachers on this side of the room, it took a vote to put Jesus on the cross. Mm-hmm. Think about that. And to understand that,
I can preach right there.
And when we look at how important the vote is,
I had a revelation on Wednesday. I'm sorry. Go ahead. That's good.
Yeah, but voting is so critical because when we look at what we are upon, we now have a supermajority on the Supreme Court. That, even if we do get to a place where we gotta, fight for the right to vote, could it be overturned? We're at a critical state where I want to encourage everyone to really exercise not only the vote when it's time to elect people, but look at the votes that's happening on your city council. Look at the vote that's happening on your county council. Look at the votes that's happening in your school board. I want to share this. Every year, faithfully, the Boy Scouts from Shandon community comes and sits through one of our board meetings. Now, those young kids, they don't necessarily look like me, but they're learning everything about me and my decisions. When are we going to take our young men and ladies to these meetings and let them be educated on the political process? Because we have to understand there's one quote, and I'm always disturbed by this quote, Pastor Thigpen. It says, it's better to build up children than to repair broken men. I think you should do both. I think we need to make sure we start interrupting the cycle of people who don't trust the political process. If you look at some of the numbers and the statistics, they're saying men who are between the ages of 18 and 35 refuse to vote. Shaquille O'Neal. Now, don't beat me up about this. My frat brother just voted for the first time. Hey man, I was just gonna ask if you didn't volunteer. Don't do this right now. I was gonna ask. Pastor Sim, you're gonna have to take over this conversation. But Shaquille O'Neal just voted for the first time at the age of 48. That's not just about celebrity status. That's community status. That's happening. So I'll pause right there. I don't want to talk as much as the Capitals do.
No, but I think all of this is good, and we've spent a lot of time talking about police interaction, with the effects that it has on the community, black community specifically. But I want to make a turn right quick and talk about how South Carolina ranks. In 2019, we ranked number 5 in women being murdered by men. What do you think we can do, especially as men, to fix that?
We have to start talking about relationships and how to maintain healthy relationships as soon as we know that our young people are engaging in dating. I think the earlier we do that, the better. Well,
I agree.
I mean, it's okay to date, but how do you maintain dating that person? What happens? And what we're finding is happening at the high school level, especially at the college level. Relationship violence is real. And we're finding a lot of times the parents had no idea that their child was being abused by this person. And it manifests itself into adulthood. And ultimately, we're seeing where the homicide rate is increasing as it relates to homicidal violence in relationships.
I remember two instances when I was in college where I saw it firsthand, and it was shocking. I remember me and my wife. She was dropping me off at the dorm. We got something to eat, and we were sitting talking in front of Mitchell Hall, and it was a couple that was sitting in the car in front of us, and all of a sudden we saw the car moving back and forth, and when we looked up, he was literally pounding her face. And I mean, very strong guy. And it took a few other guys to see what was happening, pull him out of the car. And that was the first time I ever saw, something like that happen. But the sad thing about it is she stayed in that relationship. And so I think to answer this question, my thoughts are when we start dealing with broken men, and we start dealing with even broken women who would stay in a situation like that, where he says, well, if you leave, I'll do the following things to you. These threats. So she's afraid to leave for her life or for her children's life. And we see this cycle. But I think in order to really address this issue with men, we have to pour back into men, but we don't have the examples I think we should have, or as many as we should have. And we have to address it that way. And so do you all have anything you want to say in response to how we need to not abuse women?
Right. I do know that we have dropped statistically. We're no longer, I think, in the top 10. So that is some good news. And I know there's been a lot of work and education along that lines. And I know the legislature's done a lot in that area. It hits home really personal for me. I had a young lady that was shot 11 times on Farrell Road. And, remember preaching a funeral, remember ministering to her family. And I know they still are deeply impacted by the loss of her life. And I'm just going to speak very frankly. I know in having conversation, it was a young man she used to date. She wasn't dating at the time, but I do think her emotional ties to him allowed her to be vulnerable and to open herself up to really someone who had malice and, malicious intent in harming her. I can't speak to his mindset or his motivations. He had a mutual friend at the church who he grew up with, so it was kind of like a connection on both sides, much more so to the young lady than him. But my point was, I know the parents look at it as a gun violence issue, and, I think when we talk about dating violence, I think it's one of those, again, taboo subjects in our community. Nobody wants to admit that they're hitting or they're being hit, or that they're in a violent relationship or have allowed themselves to be susceptible to such. I've counseled people from the community who go to another church but really ashamed to go to their own pastor and tell them that they're in an abusive situation. And, I think, and I want to give an example, but I think it really becomes with talking about what a healthy relationship looks like, right, and setting expectations and standards. And like a lot of times, sometimes when people are in these, particularly when they're grown, they're financially dependent, meaning like they want to leave, but they can't leave because they're financially dependent. So I think we have to talk about financial dependence and independence and how you ensure that no one is in that type of situation. I think we have to talk about what a healthy relationship is. And I think we have a great responsibility even as pastors because, I think a lot of times we don't even talk about it and address it from our pulpit to say that this is not acceptable. I remember, vividly counseling a couple in my office, and fella act like he was going to beat his wife in front of me. And, I'm a man's man, and so I don't shy away from confrontation. And so I'm like, no, I can't control what you do outside of here, but let me tell you what you're not gonna do in here, right? And he brought his wife to counseling. Why? Because she was using the means that she knew to protect herself, and she was basically saying, I won't sleep with you as long as you abuse me. And so he was bringing her into me to say, Pastor, tell her that the Bible says she's supposed to sleep with me. Right? And you know, there is a conjugational duty and responsibility, but there also is, I know I'm talking preachers, 1 Peter 3, it talks about honor your wives as the weaker vessel, or else the Lord won't hear your prayers. And I said, so you need to work on you, and don't worry about her. You need to work on you. And, you know, I stopped counseling her and began to the broken man piece, really just counsel him. And he was upset and frustrated with me saying, well, why are you not counseling her? I said, because she already told me she want to leave. And my only counsel to her is to leave your black tail alone. That's my counsel to her. And you need to get yourself together. Yeah, but I don't think a lot of times, I said all that to say, a lot of times I don't think we're willing to have those tough conversations, particularly when it comes to men. You know, because a lot, particularly, and I think there's something culturally about us as African-American men. Ain't no other man going to tell me what to do in my house. I think the reason why we see a lot of men not in church, because they don't want to necessarily yield to another man who has a certain degree of authority in a place that really, they're at a disadvantage because maybe they don't know Scripture the way we know Scripture. But my point is, there has to be tough conversations. And I keep coming back to this word, whether we talk about politics, whether we talk about policing, whether we talk about the home life relationship between man and woman, there has to be accountability. And accountability doesn't mean that I have to necessarily say you are right or wrong, but what we cannot do is suffer in silence. We cannot condone things that are ultimately destroying us. We have to say, no, you got to give an account. So that says whatever it is that you're doing, there's somebody that you need to be accountable to. Right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? So, I mean, brother, great brother, I know he go hard for his community. There's somebody that he got to be accountable to, whether it's those people that vote him in, whether it's a mentor, whether it's his father, whether it's a brother who is iron and sharpen iron, me, you. Each one of us, we got to have somebody, okay, I got to give an account. I did this. Right?
Hey, I just want to give a quick interjection, and it's very brief, Pastor Sam. Hurt people. Amen. And I think one of the things we're hurting with in our community is that we are afraid to get mental health counseling. Oh, God, yeah. And I think as pastors and community leaders, we need to encourage brothers to go check on their mental health. Because when we look at the mental health of everyone, sometimes we do it in group therapy, like men's ministry meetings, women's ministry meetings, but sometimes you need to go by yourself. I'll tell you no lie. This is transparency. You know, I thought because I was praying to God and He was answering my prayers, that I can go and exercise myself spiritually on a Sunday morning. I can go eat a good meal, take a vacation. I really didn't need to go and see somebody about my mental health. But it was one of the biggest breakthroughs in my life. Because if I can do my physical health in the gym, I can go to a banker and get my financial health in order. Yeah. I can definitely do the same with my mental health. And it was such a release and a great turn in my life that I know I became healthier just off the first visit. Although there's layers to it, I think we need to definitely exercise it as black men.
I totally agree. I remember preaching a series a few years ago, and the title of the series is called I Need Counseling. And I remember telling the church, you don't need prayer, you need a couch.
That's right.
And sometimes you need somebody to walk you through, because some things, we want to put everything in the spirit realm. When some things you just need to deal with your emotion, we need to deal with what happened. And yeah, there may be a spiritual attack or something is going on, but sometimes you just need somebody to just walk you through. And so we talked before the platform, and this will be the last thing we say, then we'll close out. And you were sharing how the pandemic, violence, and everything that's happened, and the impact it's been having on police. Do you mind sharing?
Yeah, I was sharing earlier that we had to refer more people to counseling than I know that I ever have in my 22 years. And it's because of all of those things, right? The pandemic, the rates of violence, seeing what we see. And it used to be a taboo subject in policing. Nobody wants to go see the police psychologist, because guess what that means? I'm going to take your gun and badge, and you're going to, So we have to let our officers know that that's okay. And we have to encourage that they do that. Because what I've also found that during the pandemic, the levels of interaction are fading as well. So I'm encouraging my officers, I'm encouraging my family members to call someone that you normally wouldn't call just to see how they're doing. You roll through your Rolodex and your contacts and say, I'm going to text this person or call that person. You'll never know what it means to them. And I think it'll make us all healthier internally once we do that. But it's a conversation that I think we need to have more broadly in law enforcement as well. Our mental health is at stake when we don't do that.
Listen, I want to say thank you to all of you for being here this evening. We've been here now for an hour. Went a little over time, like I told you I thought we would, but I want to say thank you to our viewers for watching. I would ask that you share this. After this is over, this is going to stay up on Facebook and YouTube. Share this. Let people know about this conversation, how informative it was. We're not out of information. We're just simply out of time. All of them been working all day, and for them to take time out of their busy schedule to be with me tonight, I want to say that I appreciate that. Thank you so much for being here. And listen, we're going to sign off, and I hope and pray that you have a great evening and a great week, and we will see you soon. Make sure, if you have not voted, make sure you vote. Talk to you soon.